angles of flux. This helps you identify your gravitational line centers, infinity line position levels, or levels of 2, coming in 3. We have there saying to walk in space, fly in space, and levitate in grounds. That's just the grounds in. Okay? This process line is all calculated and modified. That's why you have your chakra system. But each chakra system has its own infinity cycle. Starting out with 12 lines at 24 to 48, 72, 144. It's not a coincidence that you go in that chronological order. And it's all modified how you see it in frequency lines of your system, into your pattern, your facial recognition, and lines of travel. So this helps you identify your settings, and ground lines of sequence, and platitudes. Okay. So you're just coming into more lines of setting projections into calculated modified. So we'll go in lines of setting of the tree. There's the tree, right? Tree travels its own system, right? See what it does in its own setting. See, it's on its own system. Now you come in. Okay, identifies you. You identify what's going on. If not, in that position, you're going this way. Okay, and that communication, right? That set line of signals. So it modifies you. If it doesn't modify you in that position, it scans you in 3 centers of calculation. It scans you right away. It doesn't identify your system. You have to put up your fields like this. Okay, you put your fields up, you're good to go. It puts its own fields up because it knows where you are in frequency. You work together in information lines and set line connection sending to one subunit and lines of travel. Directing ground centers, graph screens. Of course, calculating modified dimension line rotations and ground calculation setting matrix lines and set position of travel. Set position location lines, you change your pixelation. So whatever you do, the tree does. In frequency, you travel and work together, right? Now the modification of itself reveals itself when it's recognized your patterns in position, because the tree itself gave you instructions. It's already been through your timeline, which is the spectrum of itself. It doesn't need to understand its alteration. You have to understand what you created through alteration. And to keep that in balance, you're sending through all levels into your ego's adaptations and the process of you going through stories, not connecting to a story. All right, so let's get into coloration lines of grounds, coloration lines of pattern, coloration lines of light metaphors, and time sequence, times calculus, times set lines, times pi. Okay, so that puts position lines of settings into the actual system of the tree itself, which is nothing of a pyramid in set travel. Okay, so it has 2 core centers, 2 grounds, 3 centers of surface, 4 centers of measure, set lines of scale of communication. Directing ground centers line position of flux, process angles, cross line signals, location sending, and calculation. Okay, that's an actual tree. So the tree is revealing itself in the settings. Now you have your position, which is your connect to your energetic dome. Okay, you have to have an energetic dome. Your energetic dome line connections is your rainbow graph screen. That processes your indication lines to your frost bridge, directing location 3 lines, sending at 12 angles, and travel communication sending to your particle system. Sending point lines of graph, directing ground centers, echo sonar. Sending at waving line panels, process indication lines of electronic location sending calculation. So that's you communicating with the pyramid, and the pyramid communicate with you now. Now, you can turn yourself into a pyramid. That's totally fine. Okay, so whatever you do, the tree does. All right, so it's like see, it's constantly in a constant continuous flow, internal and external force that your body has to come in a metric meter location to its polarities so it can understand its central system, right? So for example, you sit lines of 2 over 7 equals 2, right? Time plus, times measure, times scale, box frame, triangulation, into circulation of Fibonacci, okay? 7 over box, 2 over triangulation, 7 over line course sentence Fibonacci over square. Look at that, disappeared, right? All right, so that's lines of travel, direct lines of link. Sets communication height center, so change the flux over time frame. Sets position. Is it there or is it gone? No, it's still there. Travels all together, set lines of sequence. Bring it back, fail safe. Process indication lines where it left off in its own concept, its own awareness, location of travel. Okay? Set lines of 2 into another set position of Fibonacci. Set sequence, balance communication lines of grounds. Back to fail safe, process line indication setting, where it's set location, it's set calculation lines to its travel. All right, box frame, triangulation frame, over frame line course centers, over convergence, set position, location, measure, and scale of pyramids. 4 centers, line course centers, directing 4 centers of travel, indicate position lines of 4 calculation screen locations. Okay, graphing screens, illumination ground centers, graph calculation lines, panels operation, highways over travel, 3 centers of flux over scale, 2 centers of measure, and flux over time frame. Cross indicates line course centers and direct lines of watts over line rotation and compass, directing 3 centers of calculations, 4 centers of travel, 4 lines of indication setting, 5 lines of measure and scale. Sites communication high convergence, directing on-set lines on signal line communication setting on travel. Pauses, echo, sonar, flux, directions, and communication setting calculation. Directing ground centers on signal location setting and convergence, all through setting of operation. See? So it's amazing what you can do in position lines of setting. Now it correlates the calculation system. Welcome to the apple. There's an apple right there. Boom. Right? Okay, so it's amazing how you see that. Coming position lines of high centers and lines of travel, directing ground centers of flux. You can cross angles and set lines of communication. Right? So, understand the construct of what you're doing puts all lines of information system in your gridding system, lines of calculation, lines of grounds, guys. How to modify your system is knowing how to see it through the simulation system. Okay, I see an apple. Observation lines, course centers calculations, fortified flux angles, void operation lines of signals and locations, right? Convert the system, travel lines to point graphs. Measure and scale, pixelation grounds, okay, overline signals into ground sequence. Coloration lines like line centers, light metaphors. So coloration line and light metaphor is a way to say something in a direct point of view. Okay, going fast forward in your system, somebody that's going really forward. They talk forward in lines of travel, right? But setting the pixelation lines and how you want your apple to look. It's very powerful stuff in sequence, both the settings of simulation. Now, getting to grounds is extremely important now because we're coming in infinity of 3. We're in 2 now, right? Once it reaches 24, the course center is a calculation of gravitational pull. Everything around your system is going to be fast tracking your settings, hours of seconds. So it's going to help you identify your setting hours and minutes, and you come into your line course centers, convert the system into light years. You start living light years in real time. You have to know what it's like to actually live in space at time frame of no time frame. This helps you identify your system lines of calculation, lines of travel. Okay. Now, how you see line screens process your system pixelation grounds, how to see the modification system, your ground lines and set lines of travel, operation sequence of ground lines of communications and set calculations. Okay, it's all through an apple, right? And you work with inside this structured design line. Okay. Okay, or you can work with the formats, set lines of travel, of indication. Right. So there's so many ways to look at your system in representation, your presentation lines, preservation. This helps you to basically understand how to see you more levels of floating device lines, screen definition using telepathy locations, ground lines of settings, platitude locations, crossing angles, setting new structure, and division. Right? So you've never seen the same apple because it's always in different frequencies of design. Okay? It's never the same. It's always something else in travel. Okay? Now it's traveling, it has its own highways of indications. Look at that, all through the apple. Right? It's amazing how you see the platforms come in line screen adaptation of travel, guys. All through indication setting. So each particle changes the screens, change the platforms, change the molecules, protons, neutrons, photons, line positions. Measure and scale, measure and balance, measure and precision, and line course centers, precise. Line course centers converts into lines of travel. So you change course centers, change time centers, change time squares, change pixelation grounds into blue lines of screen location. Now in blue is now purple. Okay, red and blue is purple. Right, it's purple, right? Measuring colors, that's where you have to come into hydroponics. Coloration lines and settings all through calculation screen locations. But you guys have to understand how to create this in your own anomalies and now come into the acceptance of what you're doing through graph screen locations. So everything has its own highways and it's set into its own modem. So it's very powerful stuff. Now it can set lines of triangulation. Okay, that cross overrides the system and pyramid activation lines into illumination grounds. Okay, there's the pyramid, right? So it could change formation lines of settings. Remember, it's not an apple anymore, it's something else. So it formulates its apple and turns anything it wants to turn itself into. So to particleize the settings, change the particles, change the streamings, change the holographic gridding, change the algorithm location lines of the organ into the clocking lines of time frame. So it's pretty amazing when you start to see the modulation system of the calculation and simulation. Okay? And then basically you can actually see yourself on the platform of communication inside the actual design that you created in position in line center location of travel, right? So it's amazing how you can actually see yourself in that position on this platform. Plane mechanism time frame, travels point lines, vortex over here, and you're vortexing out in travel communications of indication. Okay? So there's nothing you can't do through your mind frame and correlation lines of panel, guys. All through indication. All right, very powerful stuff, face recognition, right? So, you just have to understand the basic grounds how you see everything in platform of a set position of transition, of transit. Divots of data, it's information panels that process indicates the setting, all through set operation with set lines of sequence. Okay, directing code lines, rotation lines of grounds. Panel operation screen lines, flux over screen, 4 centers of measure, 5 lines of scale. Location grids, laser tractions, laser directions, laser locks, course centers, convergent line positions, high travel point lines, calculate and modify into high travels, highways convergence, directing inset line course centers, a skynet and screen line. There's your sky. That's your sky, inset lines of travel. Very powerful stuff, guys. Starting to recognize that in your simulation. Okay? And understand that, understand position lines of bedding, and plotted to locations with portal sequence, and Stargate and screen adaptation of flux. Okay? Now you look really close, you can see the solar sail of its travel. That's direct location of triangulation flux, right? Water sequence above the system. Plasma lines, 3 center course, over lines, 2 centers, lines of 1, process over 2 over travel. Okay? Now, there's a level meter and lines of triangulation in high centers in frame communications. Also window frames of travel communication at direction. All right? What you understand the pixelation grounds, you understand how to go through the travel inline centers outside inline rotation. Okay, working with outside line graphs and snowy graph high centers into positions and modulations in cloak and dagger. Okay, bringing it through the equation lines, 42 locations and graph screens. Process lines of row graph screen and adaptation of flux. Process in position location of systems. There's the dimensional door and set lines of sequence. There's the door. Travel outside signals, avoid lines of convergence, and direct lines of link and process calculation. So I'm just showing you more levels when you reach higher line condition setting, but you have to get your gravity line positions. So the infinity cycles of the ground is levitating the ground itself. So that's where basically you're going faster than the grounds, and everything that you're in position of your toxicity and your density in real time is now floating above the surface, and you have to go with the surface. You can't be here because you'll be looking up, right? So it's not about being left behind, it's understanding how to balance your equilibriums of your polarities and your conjectures in location with you're going in directions of the division, especially when you're going through those different levels. Escape, panels, time frames, time calculations, time screens. I change direction and time frames and travel communication. Different door, right? Another different door, different shape, different model, different type, different travel recognition time frame, right? Comes in this, in that position. All right, geometric lines of shape, process of indications. Okay? And when you work inside, you're working within the highways now. That's a direct line length of process indicates lines of travel. That's volume, the settings, the sequence, and platitude. Form the equation line course centers a monolith. Higher formation lines a hieroglyph. Process indicates its centers, work with inside rotation and simulation grounds. That's its highway. All right? Very complicated stuff in travel, isn't it? All right, so as the platitude lines, XT1000 comes in flights, and ground set is a sequence. Okay, travels point lines a graph, indicates inside line condition setting, creates supports and targets, a measure. Indicates flights over lines, and colors lines a pattern. So wherever you are in frequency, the XC1000 will be in frequency too. You got to get a round line convergence where altitude you're setting to oxidization locations and what you're doing through time capacitor, body capacitor, and flux capacitor. So you travel inside the core, position lines, that's position location. Your behavioral setting is purple. So you travel in, and line set is a docking station. Okay, you're docking in, right? So when you're docking in a station, you got a hangar. That's the platitude location, no difference than getting out of a car and seeing all levels of line position or hotel golf. Get you in your platitude location setting. X marks the spot. Directing ground centers lines of sequence. Okay? That's your home base and set lines of travel. Okay? So you platitude out and position to home base and set lines of travel and platforms. Okay? So it's really interesting when you come in that settings. Okay, docking bay, docking stations, hangar bays, launch pads, you start to recognize and position location of settings, all through its highways and indication. Okay? So it's pretty amazing stuff when you understand what's really going on with your simulation. As you have to keep your grounding, your prototypes, measures and scales, going into different units, different subunits, different lines, different positions, different calculation setting, through its activation system, all through travel. Okay? So this helps you to really get in position how you start to recognize everything around you is nothing but pixelation. All right? Let's get a wall sequence and set lines of calculation. Start with that setting. All right? Panel operation, 3 centers of travel. Okay, that's 3 centers of travel. Okay? Now you got your platforms. Okay, you got your 2 panels and you got your grounds. Okay? So once you get your grounds, you work with that setting. And then you work with this setting. Let's try to same positional levels. This is just space itself, right? Time scales, time centers is time frame, space line. So you got 2 space lines of 0 gravity, process lines of 1 indications, process lines of 3 indications into flux. So that indicates the platforms and ground lines of panel. That indicates the ground center location that's setting their travel communications. Converts the system in settings. Latitude, rotation lines and ground lines of sequence into powers of communication. Now you got your towers and direct lines of connection setting to properties, which is your building. XC1000s come in, inside line windows, and lines of travel. Now that indicates line course centers, converting the system into your position lines of settings, come to position location your primer. Directing 4 centers of signals, 3 centers of measure, 5 centers of scale, 8 lines of correlation. Directing ground centers line communication, working with inside the spectacles of travel communication. All right. Now, once you get in that position location, you can set line signals around the platforms. That indicates all grounds set position of mass. So it gets bigger and gets longitude of windows and frames into all cover centers and distribution centers in position of import and export location. All right. Power generation lines of 4 centers of signals. It's very complicated stuff through a drawing when you indicate location and what's going on through travel of indication lines of calculations. Ground centers over lines of symbolism over cross-line condition with void that lines at opposite angles that formulates a system all through pyramid of travel communication. Now once you indicate that course centers, you come in your positions, projections over lines into pyramid. There's your pyramid, right? Right above the system, right? Now we correlate course centers via the volume lines, so we change the fonts over screen adaptation to process lines of angles, and that communicates hyperspecific lines of calculation travel. So that indicates the flux lines into echo flights, echo chambers, and direct lines of calculations. 3 platforms of indication setting, 4 lines in line connections of a tipping point. The process indicates lines of high center travels, directing 3 centers of calculations, volume mass, 3 centers of calculation lines of grounds on sequence on connected high center position of travel. Now it indicates outline signals and rotation line course centers and convergence and directions all through indications, all right? All through setting. Let's get a modification lines of grounds and travel calculation screen location inhibitors of a line. So we go through the opposite angles. We go through flux line inside the pyramid rotation lines of set lines of sequence. Now we indicate lines of grounds. This panels the screens into flux over track location with convergence, directing ground centers line communications, and a 45 split lines of an angle and roads and routers and location setting and stick line time travels. Graph lines, directing structures and divisions, and location setting calculation of center. Work with the operation centers, 45 angles, and 4 centers of travel communications. right? And they do the opposite lines. There's set lines of 3, set lines of 4 and 6, and 8 lines of travel communication. Directing inside lines and travels that indicates lines of wall and sequence lines of calculation. Inside line connection setting, all through tapestry, where centers convergent lines like checkers and information lines of grounds and sequence. Operates lines of signals in location triangulation flux of angles on point lines of graph. Indicate lines of ground, security lines of measure, process lines of indication system and simulation, ground lines of sequence, okay, over cross locations, all right? Then we indicate grounds as signals into security screens. Okay, 1 position, 2 over lines, 3 over flux over travel. Okay, then we bring the outline signals, location of ground sit location. So look at the landmass, all through structure design line, working with outline center inside rotation. Okay, so we have 3 angles, 3 molecules, and screen lines adaptation. Cross line inside locations into all core centers and process of position location of Pluto. There's Pluto. Boom. All right, so indicate lines of Pluto that has a direct line length. The process indications back in flux over lines and fail safe. Now that indicates the lines of grounds of sequence, location setting to your structure line to your Skynets. Look at the Skynet. All right, so high core centers, convert to setting probing. Distributors locate lines of import and export. Process your properties, locations of your systems. This is where you come into financial fiat systems. You know exactly what you're doing through embedding of your ground lines and settings. The process your indicates and setting. The travel what you're doing, locations, setting, and constellations. This sums all communication setting and probings. Probings come in. And 3 centers of travel. That indicates position outgoing and incoming mail. That process your indicates on the high position Papa uniform of Hotel Golf. It's set lines of travel. Okay? Indicates lines of flux over lines, indirect lines of grounds, and set location system, and simulation location of structure of design lines of set lines of sequence. Okay? So, financial setting, fiat line, rotation lines of grounds, hotel golf, line rotation lines of properties, and design line. Change communication lines, high centers of travel communication setting, and longitude and latitude of string location setting to expanding. Operation line signals, location set into distributors, process line to communicate high set position at all levels. Crop circles come in through Discord and dispatch, directing ground centers into 411, direct core centers. If there's an error, it lines of core centers of trial and error, that process lines in position of 44 line settings in 404. Directing ground centers, location system, and convergence, set line position line to high measure. Anything altitude to core centers comes into span. Now the process line direct lines has no specific location setting to the process lines into the atmospheres of change, into the modification of its mind, alterates the space of the line. Travels of point lines of graph, indicates lines of flux, into portals of sequence, into ground lines of travels, and rotation lines of set travel communication. Okay, indicates line centers, inside location setting, and spectacles of sonar and travel. Okay, web and over lines, rotation lines of grounds. Now we set up, of course, centers, convergent system and settings, volume and lower lines, purple screens, 3 centers of travel. Okay, and 4 centers of scale and 5 centers of measure. Okay, sets position to its energy of dome, pi generations, flux over screen, adaptation to travel. That indicates location. Okay, so that process line, there it is. Base recognition. All right, storage in its own system of properties of design. Okay, so every time the orbs come in, they distribute your location, your package in position lines of box frame, triangulation, time shares, block shares. Core centers, calculation lines, in colors, lines of different patterns. You got male of orange. You got male and position lines of all lines of blue. So it's different coloration lines of pattern. That procedure indicates the setting to your pyramid that goes into your line core center trust funds into your position of financial systems and travels at point graphs. Calculation lines, gold line signals. Higher levels of properties of design line. That procedure indicates setting block shares to time shares and locations and settings to your set position operation. Okay, so that's how it works in distributions into import and export location. Okay, but that's what it is. Okay, through its properties. The energetic dome line, rotation line of the grounds, and set location setting to your properties of design. Okay, very powerful stuff, guys. Extremely powerful. How you indicate that in all information system, all through travels, all through calculations. Okay. All right, so I think we'll stop there and travel because I have to indicate lines and directions in ground center sequence. Let's see, it's 10, 30 lines, centers, and screens. We can set lines of position locations in 15 line centers, 20 over scale. But I got to be out of here. Line position location 11, 11, rotation lines of grounds in sequence. So this platitude locates and setting how you see your conversion system into simulation grounds, powers, and the atmospheres and highways and travels, how to indicate that positional location or settings to your trials and errors. This helps you to modify your system, to know exactly how to use the point lines of graph of your indication system, how to use your financial fiat system, off the calculations. All right.